Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for returning. We have now set the stage for what we're looking at, as Brig called it, this moment in time. And part of the way we wanted to structure our presentation is now we're going to look at specific challenges. We know what the goal is. We want to achieve this renewable energy transition in a just and sustainable way. And doing that, we will encounter many challenges. And we're going to tackle the first one here, which is facility siting. So I'm going to introduce Danielle Endres. She is the Director of Environmental Humanities Program and a Professor of Communications at the University of Utah. She's going to be our moderator for this next panel of distinguished guests who have wonderful perspectives that I'm looking forward to hearing, and I'll allow her to introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. This panel features scholars and practitioners who are going to speak about a renewable energy transition. And I'll open with a few comments and then I'll introduce our panelists. So too often, at least I find in my own research, discussion of renewable energy transitions gets too focused on the technology alone. Of course, the technology is important. We can't achieve any sort of transition in our energy uses without technology, but we also know that the technology alone will not ensure an energy transition, particularly one that is democratic, sustainable, and inclusive. So the social, political, cultural, ethical, of course, legal dimensions of energy transition are crucial to any conversation that we have about the transition. So I come to this panel with a focus on energy democracy, which is a framework for understanding and implementing an energy transition that is participatory, attuned to justice and power, and based in community needs. And one of the assumptions of this framework is that there's no one technology that is inherently democratic or inherently more participatory than others. And so we need to look at the life cycle of renewable technologies. We need to look at particular communities and places to be able to make the best decisions. And part of energy democracy also includes the really important focus on policy and legal dimensions. And that's part of the reason that we're here today. So this will be a moderated panel discussion with a wonderful group of scholars and practitioners. And I'm pleased to briefly introduce our panelists. I'll give their names and titles, and then they will have a chance to tell you more about what their work is. So we have Ranjit Deshmukh, an assistant professor of environmental studies at the Environmental Studies program and the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. There. We have Erin Overturf, who is the Clean Energy Director at the Western Resource Advocates. Then we have Heather Payne, Professor of Law at Seton Hall University School of Law. And then we have Frederic Sourgens, I hope I said that right, at the James McCulloch Center in Energy Law, and he's the director of that at Tulane Energy Law Center. So welcome to our panelists. As you know, the first question I have for all of you is, how does your work relate to energy transition?
Look at that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I have to make a disclaimer in that I'm the dino in the room, I guess, in that I am really an energy lawyer by way of oil and gas. So you're having an oil and gas lawyer on this panel. Shock. My work, though, is all energy transition, and my research focus is on energy transition in an international context. I work with OPEC on energy transition, and to make a shameless plug for a book that might be out there later, have written principles of international energy transition law with OPEC's General Counsel. And so my work tends to be on how do we get from A to B to get to a just transition in a net zero world from the perspective of somebody that you wouldn't necessarily expect to say those words.
So my organization, Western Resource Advocates, works to fight climate change and its impacts to protect the land, water, and people of the Western United States. So more specifically, our clean energy program, which I lead, works on state-level policy in the Interior West with a focus on public utilities and accelerating the clean energy transition. So that means, in real life, activities like participating in state-level utility regulatory proceedings, shaping and influencing state legislation, and bringing our technical utility expertise to broader coalitions of advocates who are fighting for our equitable clean energy future. State-level policy is one of our best and most effective tools to advance the energy transition, and so that's where WRA works.
Thanks, everyone, for having me on this panel. My research group, which is called the Clean Energy Transition Laboratory, and then I'm also part of the Environmental Markets Lab at UC Santa Barbara. What we do is we focus on two different thrusts. One is looking at how do we decarbonize the electricity grid, and that includes balancing trade-offs for renewable energy siting to planning and operations of low-carbon electricity grids. And then the second thrust is on the transition of oil and gas sector, and how do we model the phase out of oil and gas, and then for both these thrusts, what the impacts would be on health, on employment, and which communities accrue the benefits and losses of this transition. So we use multiple methods from engineering, economics, as well as survey-based methods to address these questions.
Good morning. So I primarily work on the regulation of monopoly utilities and the governance of the independent system operators, regional transmission organizations that deal with the regional and interregional transmission. Other facets of my work address information asymmetry and adaptation, and everything has a focus on equity and how we retain that focus as we work through the energy transition.
Great, thank you for those. The first question is, what do you see as the biggest challenges in ongoing energy transition to renewable energy and decarbonization? If you're able to speak to this, are there particular challenges that are faced within the U.S. West? If you can't speak to the U.S. West, we want to hear about the other contexts in which your expertise will tell us about these biggest challenges that we're facing in energy transition. And anyone can start.
So this is an incredibly broad question. I think we've already heard a lot from our first two keynotes, right? That certainly were on my list. Transmission and how long it takes to get transmission built certainly is one of them. Other ones that I don't think have been mentioned so far this morning, I would say the continued expansion of the natural gas distribution system, especially in the residential and small commercial context, would be at the top of my list. The fact that we have had insufficiently strong building codes for a couple of decades. We're starting to see some movement on that, but certainly I think more needs to be done. One of the biggest issues that I think that we need to think about is changing weather patterns, especially for the West, drought, and how that impacts not only the generation of hydropower resources, but also the impact that that has on the cooling cycle for every single thermal generator, and realistically how we can think about minimizing the impact that that can have on our system overall. Transmission would help a lot with that, but it's not going to solve all of it.
So if I was going to sum up the biggest challenge, it would be the same as I would have summed it up 5 years ago, which is a lack of political will. So what we're seeing right now in some of the states in which I work is a significant and very real backlash to efforts to reduce emissions and transition to a clean energy economy. So right here in Utah, for example, this year we've seen a wave of bills that are aimed at slowing the transition and supporting, subsidizing, and otherwise locking in the continued utilization of highly polluting, highly expensive coal-fired generation facilities. We can go into the details of that legislation, but I will say that it's not limited just to kind of traditionally red states like Utah, where we see a lack of political will. What we're also seeing is that even in states that are climate leaders, like Colorado, we're still not reducing emissions in line with what the science tells us we need to achieve in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We're still not acting with the urgency and the speed that this problem requires. Every ton of carbon or methane that we keep out of the atmosphere is a form of harm reduction. It is a gift to future generations, but at the same time, the pace and the timing of those reductions really, really matters. Multiple economic modeling efforts have shown that in order to reduce emissions economy-wide 50% by 2030, which is what the science tells us is necessary, we need electric utilities to reduce their emissions 80% or more by 2030. Quite simply, we're not on track to do that. Even in Colorado, where we've got utilities that are really leading, like Xcel Energy, we still see that the state as a whole is not on track to achieve its science-based greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And then when you turn it, kind of look at this bigger context, what we've seen at the federal level is adopting policies that are really more incentive-based. You look at the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, the entire premise of the Inflation Reduction Act lays on a foundation, an assumption that states and regulators are making economically rational decisions about energy policy on behalf of customers. And I think it's time to question whether that is a fair assumption.
So I want to touch upon a couple of points that were highlighted by the first speakers. And that's about, yes, we have a big backlog of projects that are waiting to be permitted. We want to reduce that permitting time, both for transmission and renewable energy projects. But as Eric had mentioned, we can't really rush through that to make sure that we hear from our community. But the question that really arises for me is what do we mean by community? How do we ensure that the benefits flow to the right communities or people who are going to be harmed? Maybe their property values are going down. Who are we hearing from? Are we hearing from the loudest voices? Or how do we ensure an equitable transition? And that's a question that always comes to my mind. And how do we balance having an equitable transition, but also a speedy transition?
So I would look at it more from a global than a U.S. perspective, and I think you have two challenges that go on at the same time. One of them is that about 3 billion people on Earth consume less electricity per year than your refrigerator. Our energy access problems globally are significantly greater than we might assume when you look at it from the perspective of the U.S., and energy poverty exists within the U.S. if you look, for instance, at the Navajo Nation. So we need to significantly increase energy access. That's a challenge that is tremendous. It's tremendous because energy access does actually couple to economic growth in all societies that are not post-industrial. So we've heard in post-industrial society there seems to be a decoupling. I would question to what extent that decoupling takes into account emissions from all the things that we consume, and looks at the entirety of Scope 3 emissions and energy intensity, or whether it just looks at our production processes. But leave that aside, we need to increase energy access. At the same time, we need to increase that energy access in a way that we can meet the goals that we have set for ourselves at the first global stocktake in Dubai. That first global stocktake called on a tripling on installed renewable energy capacity globally by the year 2030. We currently stand at about 3,000 gigawatts. IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, called for a goal of about 10,000 gigawatts of installed capacity globally. That kind of matches up. If you're wondering what is the price tag of that, that's where de-risking comes in. We need to de-risk that. McKinsey estimates that we need to invest somewhere around 9 trillion with a T per year. IRENA estimates that we need to invest somewhere around 5 trillion per year, and that is without interest. That's just the capital cost of putting these things in. And if you want to have some kind of comparator, the entire budget of the People's Republic of China is 3 trillion per year. So we need to do more on energy transition per year than the Chinese government is investing in everything. In order to get that done, we need to reduce the risk of those projects so that we decrease capital costs for those projects, so that the people who need the electricity actually have the electricity. Because part of the problem is that that communities don't necessarily get access to those projects, right? So those are the challenges from a global perspective. We need to increase energy access at the same time as we need to increase renewable energy rollout, at the same time as we need to decrease political risk, at the same time as we need to decrease capital risk. So we got our work cut out for us.
Thank you. A question came in from the audience that I'd like to see if anybody has a response to before we move on. And that is to describe the role of water, water rights, and water resource regulation in the transition to clean energy. And this relates maybe to some of the points that Heather made about drought being particularly a problem here in the U.S. West. So does anybody have any response to that role of water, water rights, and water resource regulation in the transition?
I would actually argue that whoever asked that question should go find Lincoln Davies at lunch, because he is going to be the person in this room that I know of who is best equipped to answer that question. He's done a significant amount of work around water and generation. So any answer that I would give would pale in comparison to what Dean Davies could actually provide on that point.
The one thing I could kind of sketch for us right now would be to say you have a massive problem for hydroelectric generation. So you saw Norway in trouble, and you saw Ecuador and Brazil in trouble due to drought pressure on hydroelectric, which caused Ecuador and Brazil to say in their nationally determined contributions that they must diversify away from hydro. If you think that this is only a problem for renewables, think again. Nuclear power plants ran out of cooling water in France because they didn't have the ability to pull from the rivers because they were dry. So water is a massive problem. And when you then look at how you use water, when you look at the different usages in agriculture, fracking, and other industrial processes, you're looking at a massively stretched problem where we need to figure out where we're going to look at water. You look at the Colorado River Basin, you look at the Mississippi River Basin, all that water is accounted for, and we're actually getting more energy intensive and more water intensive. So we've got some math to do.
The only thing that I would add that hasn't been said yet is that as you retire some of these larger, particularly coal-fired generation facilities, particularly here in the West, often that frees up very senior water rights that were held by those generation stations. So there is an opportunity to really marry the clean energy transition with increased river health. Western Resource Advocates also has a Healthy Rivers department where we think about the Colorado River Basin very deeply and have been able to leverage opportunities at public utilities commissions to weigh in on how those senior water rights should be utilized to the benefit of the broader basin.
Thank you. So Ranjit mentioned balancing the equitable and the speedy transition, and I think that is one of our key challenges. Leads to one of the questions I wanted to ask. How do concepts like just transition, energy justice, and energy democracy relate to energy transition? And then what are some of the things that are needed to ensure that energy transition doesn't further burden frontline, most impacted, and most vulnerable communities and ecologies?
So I can touch upon some of my work that we take in my lab. And we are just starting to, touch upon this subject as a community, as an academic community, is to try to bring in other co-benefits like health benefits, right? If you're going to do more renewable energy power plants and retire coal or natural gas power plants, you're going to reduce air pollution. Air pollution is one of the biggest factors for premature mortality, right? But then if you retire coal plants or natural gas plants, you're also going to have some employment losses. You're going to have employment gains through building new renewable energy power plants. But then those sites may not be the same, and those jobs may not be translatable. So the question is, as you develop these pathways for the transition, where you're going to site this infrastructure, how different policies may affect retirement of fossil fuel infrastructure, their timing, the build out of renewable infrastructure, of transmission lines, you can create a picture on how the health benefits are accruing to different communities, how the employment gains or losses are also accruing to different communities. So those are some of the methods that we can use to see whether gains and losses can be somehow balanced. How do we manage those trade-offs where people are going to experience more losses? Can we introduce more training programs? Can we see where tax revenue losses are happening? But unless we do these kind of studies, we cannot sort of inform policy and let the energy transition, let's say like Texas, just run amok. But I think we can do much better in terms of our planning processes.
So, you have one problem in that you have a competitive global environment. So people want to take their part and have an edge in the new energy economy. If you're looking at what you see in places around the world at the moment, you have energy transition conflicts that are erupting, and you see various stakeholders saying, well, I want to have my IP and I want to be a leader in this. If you want to have a successful transition that is just, you need to make sure that you don't block people out from joining the innovation frontier. So at the same time as we negotiated the Paris Climate Agreement, the United States brought a claim against India before the World Trade Organization to block it from developing and subsidizing its own solar infrastructure and its own solar industry. Well, that's a no-go. If you look at the idea that the United States says that our solar industry and our renewables industry managed to start without any subsidies, I'd remind them about PURPA. So you have these hypocrisies in the global playing field that we need to expose to sunlight and actually address in a manner that fairly distributes benefits and burdens globally, not just nationally.
I think in addressing this question that there's value in standing back and looking at the bigger picture. And the reality is that there can be no just and equitable future unless we significantly reduce emissions in the next decade. reducing emissions is the foundation to a just and equitable future. We cannot have it if we fail to reduce carbon pollution in line with what the science tells us is necessary. So at the highest level, I think it's important to remember that. I'd also say that, as from the lens of kind of the opposite here, from international to sort of local and state-based, that from my lens as a state-level advocate, that these concepts are best woven into the transition in a way that is responsive to local history, to local context, and to local needs. There is no one-size-fits-all sort of solution to these issues. They are deeply place-based. A just transition conversation looks very different in Wyoming than it does in Nevada, for example. What one community needs might be deeply unattractive to another, and there are opportunities to advance a just transition, energy justice, and energy democracy in nearly every type of utility regulatory proceeding if you look hard enough and if you're able to identify those opportunities. And then in terms of what's kind of needed to avoid creating new burdens, I'd say two things. These are kind of basics, but we're still not doing them. The first is that policymakers need to prioritize energy efficiency in all its forms everywhere, anytime they possibly can. This includes both traditional efficiency measures and smart approaches to making the energy system, the grid itself, as efficient as we possibly can, and being really smart about new loads that are coming onto the system and what types of system impacts they're going to have. Part of how we reduce community impacts is by building only the system we truly need. The second thing that we need to do is to create a circular economy for the infrastructure that we're building. So creating strong standards around repurposing and recycling electric vehicle batteries, for example. That's a way to minimize new critical mineral extraction and other mining that's necessary. So we need to kind of build this transition in a way that addresses the impacts at the front end.
I agree very much with what Erin just said, and I think one of the things that gets left out of the conversation is if we're not moving forward at the speed that Professor Klass discussed this morning, how much we need as quickly as we need it, we are continuing the status quo, which is inherently unjust. And so when we see communities putting up barriers to renewable development, putting up barriers to transmission, the way that I think we need to start thinking about that is that that is perpetuating injustice elsewhere. And I don't think that that point gets made very often. I don't think that we recognize that every single time we stop a project, that instead of really honestly working to mitigate and making it so that it can be the best it can be, but we continue to see injustice happening. We continue to have incredibly burdened communities. We continue to have significant health impacts that are occurring. I think other things that we need to be thinking about more broadly are when we have incentive money, where is it going? And we're starting to see at the state and some at the federal level where we're targeting that money much more carefully toward low and moderate income consumers or housing, affordable housing, where it can have a much greater impact than if it is available just generally. Professor Klass this morning also talked about the health impacts. We've already talked about the health impacts more of continued fossil fuel use. I think we have to talk about that more than we have. I currently live in the Northeast, and I bring into my environmental law class what my filter looks like after 2 months, and it is black. The amount of air emissions that exist that people live with daily really have a significant impact, but it is mostly silent and is killing people without them having a full understanding of how it's impacting their lives. Indoor air quality is another place that I think we need to have more of a focus through the transition to really get the justice issues right. Small rental units with older appliances and incredibly poor ventilation. If those appliances are natural gas, can have a significant health impact on those families. And that's something that regulation doesn't touch at all right now.
One thing that is really so maddening about it is, on the one hand, you want to say, look, we need to get this done, right? And then there are people like Peter Drahos, who wrote a book, Survival Governance, that said we should all adopt the Chinese model. They're incredibly good. They don't talk to people, they just do it. And that has flags go up for me. Is that, no, you can't do that, right? You have a democracy deficit at that point. So I think even though we're going more slowly than we might, I mean, I have a deep distrust of shock therapy, having represented the government of Mongolia in the past and seen what shock therapy has done over there economically. So it's kind of finding the balance. We can't go too slow, but we can't insist on going too fast, because we need to move communities in and get a broad-based buy-in for what it is that we're doing. And that really is the justice problem, right? I mean, we need to get everybody's buy-in and take them seriously, even though we say, no, but you're not getting it, right? And that I think is so maddeningly difficult when you look at the numbers and when you look at where projects are going and what they do.
And I don't disagree with what you've said, but I do want to just highlight that community engagement, community buy-in, cultivation is not the only reason why we're moving too slowly. That part of the reason why we're moving too slowly is that because there are very entrenched, politically powerful fossil fuel interests who are keeping us from making progress. So it's important, I think, to recognize the full breadth and suite of complexities that are keeping the energy transition from happening at the pace that the science demands.
There's a question from the audience that I think will let us dig even deeper into some of these trade-offs. And so the question is, how should we balance a community's rights versus the national needs, or the value of a declining species versus the build-out of renewables? And then returning to this conversation we've been having about the pace of transition, at some point, do we need to prioritize speed versus thoughtfulness?
The last one, no. Be very careful what you do, simply because everything you do in the energy sector touches everything else. So anything that is a fast reaction, that is not a thought-out reaction, is going to have ripple effects for generations to come. So we got to know what we're doing. In terms of entrenched interests, I mean, sure, they exist. At the same time, if you look at who it is that is expanding renewable energy access in places where few people go, it's Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are amongst the leading financiers and project sponsors in those areas. So that in itself would suggest that you have a paradigm shift that is currently ongoing, that if you just let it do what it does and help it along, will actually pick up exponential speed. So I would be more on the, look, be deliberate about this, and trust your better instincts in bringing everybody along, because everybody is coming along, and it'll work out at the speed we need if we keep on this track rather than try to move in more extreme situations.
But I do want to say that there are opportunities to speed up the transition. Right, there are folks who are working on reducing the permitting time, right, for transmission or renewable energy projects. There are ways to identify renewable, zones or priority areas, as shown by the BLM solar planning areas that we saw in the earlier presentation. But having these more programmatic permits allows project developers to sort of already identify these lands, and then we can also build better transmission connecting these priority areas to demand centers. So there are definitely ways to speed up the transition thoughtfully, but while taking into, like, I'm not saying we should do the China model, but there is definitely some happy medium where we can speed up the transition at the pace that we need to go.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that there are frustrating, unavoidable physical realities to climate change that don't care about whether we're bringing everyone along. And I think it's just really important to recognize that we live in a physical system, that when we put a set amount of tons into the atmosphere, there are going to be tipping points and cascading effects that are going to have impacts on human life that we can't even imagine. And God, I'm really the downer on this panel. And I do feel like it's important to recognize those physical realities. And again, if I think about my kind of perspective working on electric utilities here in the Western United States, I just strongly disagree that in the absence of advocacy in pushing and accelerating the transition, that the transition is going to happen at the pace that the best science and modeling tells us is necessary, because we're seeing that that's not the case. When I look at the 8 major utilities in the Western United States that I work with most closely, we're seeing them all reducing emissions, for sure. But very few are on a trajectory that is consistent with what the science tells us is necessary, and some are wildly off track. So I think there is a real need to just accept the reality of the sort of physical system that we're working within, and then design policy positions that are informed by that concrete reality of our Earth and climate system. In terms of the trade-offs of particular interests, which I think was the first part of that question, I think I would return back to, this is where local conversations and advocacy at the state and local level, I think, is most impactful. Because, again, that content, there is no one-size-fits-all of this fish is more valuable than that plant, or, whatever the trade-off is that you're kind of dealing with. It's going to need, that decision's going to need to be made in that context. And so it's hard to talk about in generalities.
I might beat you on the downer side.
Okay.
So you're not alone. So I thought I was a bit cryptic, so let me make clear what I meant by that. And what I'm talking about is correlation, not causation, right? But you have a decision in the Netherlands, in Oegenda, that tells the Netherlands to get out of coal-fired generation, essentially, to be more Paris compliant. So the Netherlands draws down coal-fired generation. At the same time, Germany is getting out of nuclear. So you draw down even more generation on the European grid. You have a dictator in the Russian Federation that has made clear for a very long time that he's going to use energy muscle in order to extort others to get his way. So you've now empowered him to make a gambit that Germany is going to fold when gas stops, because we've just handed him the largest geopolitical weapon that we could. By the way, if you don't permit LNG in the United States to supply Germany, you've doubled down on that weapon. So there are geopolitical consequences to what we're doing that we don't see if you don't see that this has ripple effects all across. Second area is the South China Sea, where the People's Republic of China is starting to push an energy transition war on us. And these wars are catastrophic if they come. So we need to be careful about, that's what I mean by unintended consequences. So move with all due deliberation so that we don't end up in a place where we end up in a nuclear exchange.
So to the first part of the question, I agree again with Erin that the trade-offs are going to have to be reviewed each individual time. I don't think that there's something that we can say, but I think that it's important for all of us to recognize that we're going to be making a lot more trade-offs than if we had started on this problem 20 or 30 years ago. We've gotten to the point, I guess this is my part of the downer panel. We've gotten to the point where we are going to be making a lot of trade-offs. We don't have the option not to at this point. And so I think we just have to go into each of those individual situations, recognizing that we can't stop because, again, if we do, it's just going to get worse. But at the same time, if we don't think about those trade-offs, then that's not where we want to be either. So we have to address the trade-offs, but we are never going to have a perfect system. We're never going to have a perfect answer. We're too late for that. We're far, far too late for that. So it's just a matter of what trade-offs we are going to make to maintain the most habitable planet that we can. I also think it is important to recognize that even where we have some utilities doing things that will help, a lot of them who tout lofty goals don't actually have plans to get all the way there, and in many cases are taking actions today that are diametrically opposed to what would be necessary to actually meet those goals. And I would say that from an investor perspective, let's all be honest, the depreciation schedules that they're putting out for those plants are not meeting what goals they are claiming either, which I think is a far better way to determine intent than a press release. So some are doing good things, but not enough, not fast enough, and in a lot of cases are doing things that actually are just making the problem worse.
I just want to add one more point. About the trade-offs, and I do agree that trade-offs are getting more and more sort of difficult to balance because the need for renewable energy is really high, so the land requirements are really high. But I want to touch upon, how do we address these trade-offs at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level? I worry a little bit if we go, and we should, of course, take into account all the local communities, like what they say, but I wonder if some communities have more power and prevent development in their neighborhoods and having more NIMBYism, whereas other communities that have historically not had a voice in decision-making end up bearing the burden of hosting energy infrastructure, which then perpetuates the historic injustices that we have had in the fossil fuel energy infrastructure. So it's going to be a difficult choice on how we balance this. There was one, example of moving permitting from the the city level to the state level. But then, people have to sort of give up more to host these energy infrastructure projects.
I'll just say that we're in the midst of a very complicated conversation about this right now in Colorado as part of this legislative session. And so hit me up in 2 months when the session is over, and I can tell you where that lands. But I think that, at least when I think about the Western United States and our unique context, that creating a state-level standard for how energy siting is going to work, that protects critical habitats and wildlife corridors, that eases the threat that's posed by local governments enacting moratoria or effective moratoria. I think from our perspective, that's an effective policy solution to this is a very thorny problem that can't be solved, I think, by just doing something at the federal level and getting it done. So it's going to take, I think, state level advocacy to be able to figure out some of these complex siting issues.
I find it funny in terms of people, bitterly funny, not like, funny, not ha-ha funny. When you look at the people who say that offshore wind endangers whales, because those are people who have beachfront property in Nantucket and don't want it ruined, right? Those people have, of course, outsized political ability to make their point heard. So you have that on the one hand, and then you look on the other hand, what is actually keeping these projects from going forward? What's keeping these projects from going forward is increasing steel prices. Why are steel prices going up? Well, because one of the main steel producing regions that has supported land-based wind towers in Europe is the Donetsk region of Ukraine. that we've just taken out of commission for any number of, there's an active war going on, they're not producing steel. The steel plant, Azovstal in Mariupol, was the last stand of those defenders. That plant was the plant that produced the steel that went into German wind towers. So, you look at both. On the one hand, you have the people who say, oh, you're killing whales, and it's nonsense. And on the other hand, you have the geopolitical pressures that nevertheless pull these things off the project line, simply because geopolitics comes up. It's maddening.
I think the last point that I would make is that we have a disconnect in terms of things like natural gas transmission lines, where those actually can get federal eminent domain authority, and we don't have the same federal eminent domain ability for anything on the renewable side. And so I would say that if we have federal eminent domain authority for natural gas pipelines, then we probably should do that for electric transmission. And if you don't want it for electric transmission, then we probably shouldn't have it for natural gas or carbon dioxide pipelines either.
So we've started getting into the question of different scales of governance and regulation and how energy transition involves working across those various scales. So a question I had, and then I'll add a question from the audience. What are some of the strategies that can be effective for local level governance? That's an area I'm particularly interested in, city, county, state. But I'd invite our panelists to talk about all levels of government. And then we have a question from the audience. What are the leading edge new and creative ideas to address political roadblocks at all governmental levels? That's a tough one.
Well, I'll go first, and I guess I'm going to start with that question, and I want to just give you an example. One of the largest utilities in our region is called the Salt River Project. It is a joint water and electric utility that operates in the Phoenix area of Arizona, and they are a sort of quasi-public utility whose governing board is elected on an acreage basis. So for each acre of land you own, you get a vote. Weird, right? And those elections, you have to specifically request a ballot. You don't just get sent a ballot. You've got to ask, you've got to know that SRP exists. You've got to know that they are governed by an elected board. You've got to know where to go to request your ballot, and then you've got to know who to vote for. Well, it's not going to surprise you to hear that about 1% of people participate in this election, and this is one of the most carbon-intensive electric utilities in our region. So it's not a new creative idea to sort of change that process. It's a very old idea, which is voting and making voting easy. So I think there are many, many opportunities that we have to affect change using sort of good old-fashioned, I used to be an organizer, good old-fashioned tools, right? So I don't want to just sort of undercut the ability to make change using our voices as citizens, as voters, as advocates, as people who care deeply. The other thing that I would say in terms of kind of working at different level of governments, again, I'm coming with my state advocacy hat on here, I think it's important to recognize, like, this is real hard. We're in a stage of tough trade-offs, and we're doing something that's literally never been done before. We've never created a zero-emission, equitable energy system. And so we need to have some humility about that this is, anybody who says they know exactly how to make this happen is full of it. So we need to be able to learn from each other and iterate and take lessons from what's worked and what hasn't. And your state, your region, your town is unique. It's got its own policy landscape. And the thing about, from my perspective as an advocate, you would be surprised how much of policymaking really comes down to feelings and spite, and I don't really like that guy, and I don't like what he did to me 5 years ago, right? Like, it's human. These are human beings making these decisions, right? And so you need to know the context of the area in which you're working, because every context, every forum has its own existing policy landscape, its own past failures, grudges, power players, incentives, opportunities, and you need to be able to kind of leverage those to be able to build solutions that are going to be durable and advance this energy transition. So the number one strategy I would say is being sensitive to that reality and adapting your policy advocacy in light of that. And then also, now this is the boring part, sticking around for implementation. I think a lot of people get caught up in the excitement and sexiness of getting a policy passed or getting a bill through the legislature. And I can just say from personal experience that great innovative legislation can be rendered completely useless due to critically important decisions that are being made in a dull, technical, stakeholder, working group, subcommittee, whatever, that's being held on Zoom at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday. And so if you are not engaged in those conversations as someone who kind of cares about this work, you're missing a major opportunity to make sure that we're actually sticking the landing and getting the impact that we hope we are when we pass good policy.
I guess keep doing what we're doing, I think. I mean, I'm going to have some good news for once.
good.
How's that? You look at the fact that the United States issued its first nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. Well, they negotiated it in 2014, submitted it in 2016. It predicted a path that would have a 17% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions against the 2005 base year by 2020. The Trump administration came in, so you might wonder what was our reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 against a 2005 base year, and it was 19%. So we exceeded the expectation of the Obama administration's policy that was premised on the Clean Power Plan that never went into effect, but nevertheless got implemented because it got implemented at the local and state level by states and municipalities and utilities and independent power producers that said, yeah, let's do this. So keep doing what we're doing. Asterisk. Of course, we fudged the numbers ever so slightly because if you remember 2020, that was kind of an odd year, right? So we're actually not 17% off and not 19%. We're 15.5% off if you look at the 2021 figures. But that's still an amazing progress when you consider that the federal government was pulling as hard as it could in the other direction. So whatever people have been doing seems to be working and actually implementing climate policy, which I hope that qualifies as good news for once.
So I'll completely admit, I'm a total geek, right? I am thinking about energy all the time. I think about energy on the weekends. I think about energy on vacation. I think one of the things that we all have to realize who care about this is everyone else in the world is not like us. And so, especially when we're thinking about at the local level, right? The people who may be making decisions in your town don't think about any of these issues. And so, you know, one of the things that I've actually recognized is how much education still has to happen, right? There's interesting studies that say how little climate is covered in popular TV shows, in movies, right? You know, the disaster ones notwithstanding. And so there is a good deal of electrification that can occur in buildings, right? With heat pumps, with school buses, with all sorts of things. And yet a majority of our local officials making these decisions may not even be thinking about that because energy is not their jam, right? This is not what they're thinking about all the time. And so I think knowing your local environment is really important, but also figuring out if in your state there is a potential for something like community choice aggregation where your town can actually put together a solicitation and get cleaner energy for all of the residents. There's different options, but a lot of, especially local government officials, are not going to know without additional outreach what the options actually even are.
One level of governance that we haven't talked about yet is Native nations, tribal governments. So I wanted to ask if there are unique issues or opportunities for sovereign Native nations in the energy transition. One of our audience members also asked about the question of energy sovereignty and how we might think about that as part of our discussion of scales of governance.
Yes, so I think from what the conversations that WRA has had and with tribes in our region, that what we're really hearing is prioritizing reliability, affordability, tribal sovereignty, and economic development in making energy decisions. There are more than a dozen tribes in our footprint of where Western Resource Advocates works that have transitioned to operating their own utilities, and I think that really comes from a desire to have more independence and oversight over tribal energy decisions. At the same time, clean energy development is new for many tribes who haven't done these types of projects in the past. And so there's also a need for expanded tribal capacity to plan, develop, and manage those projects. And then I would be remiss if I didn't highlight that there are complex issues around energy siting. So one of the things that we've heard from the Ute tribes in Colorado is a desire for siting decisions to incorporate and respect cultural values. The definitions of cultural resources goes beyond archaeological sites and includes changing landscapes. There are cultural resources that are not necessarily mapped. Protection of treaty rights also can be impacted by energy siting decisions. So, for example, Ute tribes have treaty protected off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering rights within the Bruneau area of the San Juan Mountains, and they don't want to see the wildlife in those areas threatened or diminished by development. So it's not as simple as just sort of looking at a map and seeing like, oh, there's an area and we're going to go consult with that tribe because this line or this site is going to impact that specific geography. That it's a lot more complex and requires more sophisticated consultation with tribal governments, particularly here in the West.
One other thing to sort of lay on top of that is one, distributed generation done well would actually help a lot of areas that are currently in energy poverty. So if one were to work not at the utility scale, one would work at the distributed generation scale, I think one could do a lot of good there and get some buy-in. And the one other thought that I wanted to add was we need to make sure that our supply chains and our value chains actually are FPIC compliant, and that when you look at where the materials come from, you don't displace Native peoples along the supply chain as well. And so there is a lot of diligence ahead of us.
And just in terms of not even only distributed generation, but in terms of things like microgrids or even nanogrids, that can, I think that is one of the main opportunities that I see, especially with storage costs coming down, that we actually could provide electricity and much more reliable electricity to some of these places than have had in the past.
I was actually going to bring up the same point, the distributed generation one. What's not being said is the context. So there's a substantial number of households on Native American lands that they use diesel generators for electricity. And that's like one of the most polluting, but also one of the most expensive energy source. So even at present costs of energy storage and solar PV, those solutions actually are more economical than just diesel generators. We have a student group in my school that is working now with Native nations on having more systems being implemented on their lands. So it's more of a question of how do we get low-cost financing that will help reduce the cost of these distributed generation sources and bridge that information gap that exists where people are still using diesel gensets where it just doesn't make sense today.
And I'll just add that distributed is a great model for a variety of different places. Some of my research is in Puerto Rico, where distributed solar is particularly useful. So just wanted to get that point in. We've had a lot of downers. I want to give us our hopeful question before I turn to the many comments that are coming in, comments and questions. What gives you hope and keeps you working towards an energy transition?
Every little bit helps. I mean, it's plan adaptation and our systems for what may be coming for a 4-degree world, and work every single day to make sure that we actually never get there.
What's exciting to me is that we have the technologies to make this happen at a cost that is going to be less than today's energy system. Wind and solar costs are coming down, battery storage costs have come down significantly, and they're coming down even more, which makes electric vehicles also affordable. So we have all these technologies. It's a question of how do we implement them quickly. So that's one. And then the second one is, what gives me hope is the young generation that, all the students in my classes, all the undergrads, they are super pumped up to participate in the energy transition, and that really gives me hope.
In terms of what kind of keeps me going, I would say just sitting and observing this beautiful, improbable living planet that we get to be on. It's I think my primary source of fill-uppedness. That's not a word, but I'm just going to use that. And then I would also say that in terms of the concept of hope, I actually have a lot of conversations about the concept of hope with people that I work with. We talk about it all the time. And there's a writer and activist named Mariama Kaba, and she has this quote that says, "Hope isn't an emotion. Hope is not optimism. Hope is a discipline, and we have to practice it every single day." And I love that. I talk about it all the time, and when I'm having a hard time finding my hope or committing to that practice, I just remind myself that the only other alternative is not to try, and that would be unbearable.
We'll make it. We'll land on a 1.5 degree world. We'll overshoot, but we'll make a 1.5 degree world. And in the process of making a 1.5 degree world, what we have to do is something that, if you listen carefully to the political discourse on the right and the left in the United States and the right and the left everywhere else in the world, is we need to build an economy and a world economy that more fairly distributes benefits and burdens from not just energy transition, but from economic globalization. We have a once in a 5-generation opportunity here to land the North-South dialogue this time round, and to land a similar dialogue when it comes to the domestic economy as well. We'll get there, and it is that getting there that will drive the rest of it, because I think people will be better off, will find themselves in a juster world because of energy transition. And that is what keeps me going every day to say, yeah, it looks bleak now, but night is darkest before the sunrise. We'll get there.
Okay, I'm going to turn primarily to the questions from our audience, so keep pushing them in and keep giving them the thumbs up so I can prioritize questions that are coming through. This first one may be more directed at Erin than others on the panel, but there's a question: where are Utah state agencies and PacifiCorp today, and where will they be tomorrow?
Where are they today? I think in terms of the energy transition, let's talk about PacifiCorp. PacifiCorp facing a very challenging political reality that comes from its multi-state operations and the different political priorities that exist across its service territory. So you have states like Oregon and Washington who are pushing the utility to accelerate the transition away from coal, and then you've got states like Utah and Wyoming that are doing just the opposite. So when in terms of where PacifiCorp will be in the future, it is very hard to tell. They did recently put out they're in the process of doing their resource planning right now, and the plan that they have submitted shows on paper a pretty substantial reduction in emissions by 2030. It's somewhere around a 78% reduction compared to 2005 levels. But it's really unclear what the plan is to actually make that a reality. They had an all-source competitive solicitation that was out to acquire new, primarily clean resources. They've suspended that RFP, and so it's really unclear what PacifiCorp's future is right now. The other thing that I think is important, it's kind of the elephant in the room, and I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, so I'll just bring it up now. Wildfire. Huge issue for PacifiCorp. It's going to be a huge issue for any utility that's operating in the Western United States. What we've seen is that the financial risks and the financial impacts in terms of increased insurance costs and liability is having a real impact on PacifiCorp's operation and on their future planning. And it's having a real political impact here in Utah as well. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I encourage you to come talk to me after the panel, and my colleagues who work on Utah all the time and are here with me today. So I think it's a real time of uncertainty about where PacifiCorp is going. I think in terms of where the state of Utah is going, this legislative session demonstrates that there is a real reluctance to move away from reliance on coal-fired generation and really pulling out all the stops to try to keep coal operating as long as possible. Economics and fiscal conservatism be damned.
Okay, we have a question about the role of CCS, or carbon capture and storage, in the transition. And then we actually also had a question, someone wanted a little more clarification about what distributed solar is. So if any of you could speak to those two questions, tell us a little bit more about distributed solar, and also what would the role of carbon capture and storage play in the transition?
Sure. So I'll tackle the second question first. So what's distributed solar? It's mainly smaller solar systems at the community level or at the household level. Your example is your rooftop solar PV. That's called a distributed solar system, as opposed to a utility scale solar system, which is like multi-megawatts, large swaths of land covered under solar panels. That's the difference. And so in the earlier context, when we were talking about distributed solar, we meant rooftop solar PV or smaller community systems that can supply solar power to a bunch of households or apartments which don't have enough rooftop space, but they can share that particular energy source. Like that's where distributed solar can come into play. With regards to CCS, I have some comments. So CCS is an interesting one, right? This technology apparently had a lot of promise. It's considered in a lot of different models, but it hasn't been commercial for a while now. There are a few projects out there that are experimental, I would say. We, at least in our models, don't see much CCS with coal. CCS may, if the technology succeeds, we could find some use on refineries, because one of the hardest sector to decarbonize is the transportation sector for flights and long-haul transportation, where we might end up still using some liquid fuels where we need refineries, and they would still end up emitting CO2, and that's one place where it may be economical in the sense, even with the high costs of CCS, we might see some applications.
You have two forms, broadly speaking. you can remove CO2 at large source points where you have a high volume of CO2, so smokestacks. And industrial plants. And to the extent that you capture CO2 there, you would then move it to an injection point. You'd store it underground in geological space where it would be permanently stored. So that would be, to sort of explain what CCS is for everybody. The other way would be that you would do direct air capture. Direct air capture would remove CO2 in ambient air, not in a smokestack, at much lower proportions in the air. When you're looking at the technology, CCS, at the current incentive level in 45Q of $85 a ton is starting to become very interesting. You have problems in terms of a pipeline infrastructure that would need to move the CO2, so we have a pipeline problem in that particular context, and we have a regulatory problem. I tend to think we can get those fixed. Direct air capture is not something that is yet ready for prime time, but my guess would be it will be. In terms of what should we do with it? Well, we're in a situation where I would think we need to move every lever all the way and then some, right? We got to ask Scotty to give us 110% on the reactor. And that includes CCS, because that is something that we can do with existing infrastructure and then see, moving each piece further, how we get there. Now, we have regulatory challenges with the pipelines, and the technology needs to get better. But technology forcing has gotten us to places, and I'm pretty sure it'll get us there too.
So I tend to think that we should be limiting the use of CCS as much as possible. Will there be certain industries where it may be beneficial? Yes. Is that anywhere near as much as what it's being discussed for right now? Absolutely not. So for the places that we've had CCS, especially on power plants, it's about a 40% vampire load. So it takes 40% of the energy of that particular generator to actually run the CCS equipment and compress the gas. So we have a significant loss of electrical generation when it is paired with CCS. And the other, there's multiple other challenges. The first is that we don't have a significant pipeline system. So for getting the carbon dioxide from where it's created to the places where you would want to have it stored from a geologic perspective, you're talking about a lot of infrastructure development, truly like massive pipeline build out for that. There have already been situations where we've had significant leaks on existing CO2 pipelines. So there are about 5,000 miles of existing CO2 pipelines in the United States. There was a town in Mississippi called Sartaria where a carbon dioxide pipeline had a significant breach. And the first responders, local hospitals, nobody had any idea how to actually treat the people that were coming in with significant carbon dioxide poisoning. And so we would potentially have significantly more health risks if we had a large pipeline system developed. The other challenge is that we don't necessarily have, as has been noted, a regulatory regime associated with underground injection that we would expect to last truly forever. The push from a lot of the companies that want to develop CCS projects right now is that basically they would have to monitor these sites for 30 years, and then that would end up, that would be the end of their responsibility. When we're talking about something like carbon dioxide, where the whole point is that we're putting it underground for hopefully millennia, so that we could continue this process of burning fossil fuels during that time, I think not having longer liability is potentially a real risk. The other challenge that I think immediately comes to mind is the fact that this does perpetuate fossil fuel use. So if we're using it for industries, sectors, uses where we could electrify using renewable generation, that continues on a path that really doesn't get us all the way in the right direction. And so I think it is being trumpeted to mainly try to perpetuate uses of fossil fuels that already exist that could be transitioned. As noted, there probably are some places where it does have benefits, but that is a much smaller subset of uses than what is currently being discussed.
I have nothing to add to that very thorough response.
Okay, this goes back to a conversation we were having earlier about trade-offs, and the question is, many panelists referred to trade-offs multiple times, but what is the definition? What are we trading away? Coal power plant utility profits, fossil fuel economy, local government autonomy. They're asking for more definition on the use of the term trade-offs. And then a related comment question was thinking about trade-offs versus the terminology of sacrifices. To change our climate trajectory, we need to do what's required. So some deeper discussion of how trade-offs is being defined by each of you.
You have an energy trilemma. And the energy trilemma says that there are three things that you would like to, okay. A trilemma is the idea that you can't do three things all the way, right? So you would want things done right, cheap, and fast, except that you can only do two of those. You can't do all three of them. So that's a trilemma. Energy has a similar kind of trilemma in that you would want energy systems to be secure, cheap, and environmentally sustainable. It turns out that these three things tend to bite at each other. So you can't maximize all three of them without having some retrenchment on one of those particular axes. And then if you look within environmental sustainability, you have to further look at what do you mean by that? Do you mean just climate, or do you mean other environmental sustainability on top of that? So when you talk about trade-offs, you're looking within this kind of trilemma, and you look at one, where are you losing? And then two, what are the distributive consequences of where those losses, according to one of those three axes, is going to hit hardest? And in terms of how you do that, you have a problem of incommensurability, because these three axes don't actually count the same thing, at which point you would have to answer Justice Scalia's quip that you would need to measure whether a rope is longer than a rock is heavy. Actually, it's possible, but that is kind of the challenge that you face in that particular context. Relative scale is the thing that does it. So that would be what this trade-off idea is and how it's conceptualized. And I think we each would have different ideas about the feedback loops and how they would impact each other. So we would come to reasonably different ideas, probably on the distributive side, but I think, you know, as a framework, that might be a starting point to get us going on that.
Yeah, I think as a sort of regulatory nerd that you traditionally think about utility regulation as being concerned with affordability and reliability. And now we've added in a third consideration, which is sustainability. And in some places we've added in a fourth one, which is community impacts and just transition. And what solves for one of those, I like your sort of trilemma phrasing, although I made it a quadlemma, so my apologies. But I think those things are at times in conflict. And let me just give you I was just reading a long article about a particular example in Colorado that I think is very relevant. And so I'll just offer it up without commentary as an example of some of these difficult trade-offs. In Colorado, we recently went through a resource planning process for Xcel Energy, our largest electric utility, that included securing a commitment for that utility to shut down the poorly named Comanche 3 coal plant in Pueblo, Colorado by 2030, which is 40 years ahead of schedule. When that plant was originally built in 2010, they anticipated it was going to run until 2070, which, amazing. So there was a commitment secured to shut down that coal plant. That coal plant is located in the community of Pueblo, which is not served by Xcel Energy, but gets all the tax base from that coal plant. Part of what we negotiated in that settlement was that Xcel Energy would make payments to the city and county of Pueblo to make up for that lost tax revenue. There's a trade-off right there. You've got Xcel customers paying for tax base for energy that they're not consuming to a community that traditionally hosted fossil fuel infrastructure. And now there's a conversation about what's going to replace that facility. That's going to be a major focus of a filing coming up later this year. You have some community advocates who say, from a tax base and jobs perspective, the only thing that will make our community whole is a nuclear facility here. And so that is the only thing that you should be considering. Whereas other people, particularly those folks who are Xcel customers, are saying, whoa, 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 I don't want to have to pay for a nuclear facility. That's going to be far more expensive than other alternatives that we could pursue. So, and that's just a small slice of the kind of complex issues that are involved in just one proceeding, in just one state for just one utility that relate to this energy transition. So hopefully that's an example of the types of tensions, conflicts, and trade-offs that regulators and decision makers are dealing with.
So this question, can any of you on the panel discuss the issues associated with efforts being undertaken to declutter overcrowded interconnection queues to speed up the transition, as this seems to be one of the most significant hurdles to meeting our goals? Is anyone able to speak to that one?
Yes, so I would say that there are a number of various efforts underway. The RTOs and ISOs are really looking at different ways to deal with this. So in some cases, they're starting to focus much more heavily on doing a cluster analysis to where all of the projects proposed for a specific area would go ahead and go through the analysis together. And so there would, in other cases, they're looking at getting much more significant fees at different points in the process from developers to try to weed out all of the projects that probably are not going to go forward, but that will clutter up, that are continuing to clutter up the queue, even though it's unlikely that the economics are going to be built. I would say we have not solved this problem yet. So the challenges around the fact that we have, in PJM, we have queues from 4, 5, 6 years ago that still haven't gotten through kind of some of the hosting analysis is really problematic. They've basically shut down the queue in multiple places to try to make it so that they can clear out what already exists before trying to re-engineer the process. I would say that in a lot of these cases, it does go to the fundamental governance of these organizations and the fact that the incumbent utilities in most of them still wield considerable control. And so could we set up processes that would be significantly better? Yes, absolutely. There's been lots of work done about how that would happen. But the problem is with the fundamental governance of the RTOs and ISOs, especially in the RTOs, and the fact that you have significant continued blocking by incumbent utilities for various reasons, but including the fact that even if it's in non-monopoly, non-regulated businesses, more renewable generation would have significant impacts on their traditional assets. And so they are looking for ways to continue to get high capacity and energy prices from those existing units, and therefore maintain profit.
Just for the students in the room, I went to a couple of facts. Correct me if I'm wrong. The capacity in the queue would double the grid as it stands, more or less. One other thing is FERC has tried to get in on the action with a new order. And if you want to read about the new order and whether it'll work, I could recommend a client alert. I normally wouldn't recommend a client alert, but this one was written by former Commissioner Sudeen Kelly that she put out about it. And what she says, and she's in favor of it, but she said the transmission planning just isn't there to really make that work. So we still have more homework to do. But if you want to have a quick and dirty read on what it is, type in Sudeen Kelly FERC interconnection order, and you'll get a really good piece. And, to give you a sense of the scale, you're looking at a queue that's, the size of the grid at the moment.
One related idea that people are discussing is reconductoring existing lines. And with the new technologies and using existing right-of-ways and perhaps even towers, we could potentially, at least one study from Berkeley is claiming that just those lines, like existing lines, and reconducting them would get us to where we need to be for a completely decarbonized system. Of course, the devil's in the detail, but there are definitely ideas such as those that are being discussed. I think one of the biggest bottlenecks is to get new right-of-ways, but if we can put new lines along existing right-of-ways or reconductor existing lines, that would be one of the solutions.
It's reconductoring, but also using dynamic line ratings is another way that we can actually get the queue significantly down. But again, many utilities are fighting any requirement that they do that.
All right, we're nearing the end. We have about 3 more minutes, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us a 1 or 2 sentence final takeaway point that they want all of us in the audience to take from this panel.
I think we should all participate in the energy transition. I think it's super exciting. Whichever level, local level, federal level, state level, it doesn't matter. It's going to happen. We just need to speed it up. There's a lot of hope in there. It's a discipline, and we should all act.
We do have the technology to get, if not 100% of the way there, although I think we do, at least 98%. And we have that technology now. We can deploy it now. We need to go ahead and work across all levels to create the political will to really make it so that we can implement at scale and quickly.
I think you've heard between the lines that there is still some disagreement on this panel, but the disagreement is on how, not on if or whether. So that's what gives me hope, that you have stakeholders from basically everywhere that all say, we must get this done, and we will get this done.
And I guess what I would say is that through whatever strange twist of fate, you are alive at probably the most consequential moment in human history. And so what skills do you have that can be put to use to sustain this beautiful, improbable planet? And that's what you should be doing.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful panel. Let's give a round of applause. And if I'm not mistaken, our next thing is...
Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful morning. We're going to break for lunch. I think it's served right out there. And we'll be back here at 1:30.